The observation lounge of Nexus Station hung suspended above the kaleidoscope colors of the Tertian Nebula, offering what many considered the most spectacular view in the known galaxy. Marcus Vale stood alone at the panoramic window, nursing a drink he couldn't identify and trying to remember why he had accepted this assignment. Somewhere between the 7th trade negotiation and the 10th formal reception, diplomacy had stopped being a calling and started being a very elaborate form of torture. "You look like someone who's considering jumping into space," a voice said behind him, smooth and tinged with amusement. Marcus turned to find the woman who had been dominating the diplomatic sessions for the past week. Seraphine of the Colethian Collective was not what he had expected. The briefings had described her as a formidable negotiator, a strategic mastermind who had united 7 fractured star systems under a single banner. What they hadn't mentioned was that she was absolutely stunning, with skin that seemed to shimmer between silver and violet, and eyes that shifted color with what he was beginning to understand was an expression of genuine amusement. "Just contemplating the career choices that led me here," Marcus replied, turning back to the nebula. "Does that make me predictable?" "Entirely predictable," Seraphine confirmed, moving to stand beside him at the window. "Which is why I'm impressed. Most humans try so hard to appear enigmatic that they become exhaustingly transparent." He couldn't help but smile at that. Seraphine had a way of cutting through the pretense that made every conversation feel like an actual exchange rather than a diplomatic dance. Over the past week, between formal negotiations, they had stolen moments like this. Brief conversations where neither of them had to maintain the careful facade of their respective positions. It was dangerous, probably violating at least 17 diplomatic protocols, and Marcus found he didn't care. "How long have we known each other?" he asked suddenly. Seraphine turned to look at him, her eyes shifting to a curious amber. 6 days, 14 hours, and approximately 23 minutes. Why? Just wondering if it's possible to know someone that briefly and still have meaningful conversations with them. "Depends on the definition of knowing," she replied. Her voice had dropped lower, more intimate. "I think I know you rather well, Marcus Vale. I know that you adjust your tie when you're nervous, that you take your tea with exactly 3 drops of honey, and that you have the good sense to actually think through the consequences of treaties before signing them. That's more than most people know about each other after years." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a dangerous warmth that had been building throughout their interactions. He set down his drink and turned to face her fully. The move brought them closer, close enough that he could see the intricate patterns that seemed to flow beneath her skin like captured starlight. "I know you too," he found himself saying. "I know that you negotiate like you're playing 3-dimensional chess and everyone else is still learning checkers. I know that you laugh at your own jokes, and that beneath all that political brilliance, there's someone who actually cares about the people you rule. I know that you're brilliant and funny and ... He paused, realizing he was veering into territory that violated every rule of diplomatic engagement. Seraphine was watching him with an intensity that made his heart race, her eyes swirling between colors, as though she was processing emotions faster than she could contain them. "And?" she prompted softly. Marcus had never been good at holding back when something felt true. Perhaps it was the lateness of the hour, or the intimacy of the moment, or simply that he had spent his entire diplomatic career being careful and controlled. Whatever the reason, the words came out before he could stop them. "And you'd make a beautiful wife," he said quietly. "Any man would be fortunate enough to spend the rest of his life knowing you the way I'm beginning to." The moment the words left his mouth, Marcus realized he had miscalculated the distance between flirtation and something far more serious. Seraphine had gone completely still, her eyes frozen in a state of rapid color shifting that seemed to indicate something he couldn't quite interpret. Her hand, which had been resting casually on the window frame, tightened its grip until the metal seemed to bend slightly beneath her fingers. "I accept," Seraphine said, her voice carrying a note of something that sounded like finality. Marcus blinked. "Accept what?" "Your proposal of marriage." Her eyes had settled into a deep crystalline blue that Marcus had never seen before, a color that seemed to contain an entire universe of intention. "I formally accept your offer of marriage, Marcus Vale." "Wait, no, that's not—" "I wasn't," Marcus stammered, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. "I was just flirting, Seraphine." "That wasn't a proposal." Seraphine turned to face him fully, and in that moment she was every inch the ruler of 7 star systems. In Calithian culture, marriage proposals are not distinguished by formal ceremony or deliberate intent. They are recognized by sincerity of words spoken in intimate context, witnessed by the presence of genuine emotion. Your words were sincere. Your emotion was genuine. You spoke them in a moment of profound honesty. That is proposal among my people. "But I didn't mean—" "Did you mean that you find me beautiful?" Seraphine asked, tilting her head slightly. "Yes, but did you mean that I would make a good wife?" Marcus opened his mouth to explain the difference between courtship and commitment, but Seraphine raised one elegant hand in a gesture that commanded absolute silence. "Among my people, such words are binding," she continued calmly. "Spoken in authentic moment, received by willing listener, and now witnessed by station records." She gestured to the small camera in the corner of the observation lounge that had been recording every diplomatic moment aboard the station. "The marriage contract is now recorded in official channels. We are betrothed, Marcus Vale." "This is insane," Marcus said, running his hand through his hair. "You can't just accept a proposal that wasn't meant as a proposal. We barely know each other." "I know you," Seraphine said simply. "And you know me. The fact that you've only known me for 6 days is irrelevant. Some connections transcend the measurement of time." Her eyes shifted to a softer purple, almost vulnerable. "Unless, of course, my acceptance is unwelcome to you?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that extended far beyond mere political alliance. Marcus found himself caught between the logical realization that his life had just been irrevocably complicated and the completely unexpected realization that he wasn't entirely sure he wanted that complication undone. "It's complicated," he finally said. Seraphine's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile. "The best things usually are." The royal quarters of Seraphine occupied an entire section of the Calithian star cruiser Verdant Symphony, and Marcus felt distinctly out of place standing in the center of what could only be described as a floating palace. The walls seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, shifting between solid crystalline surfaces and translucent panels that displayed swirling nebulas and distant star systems. Furniture appeared to grow organically from the floor itself, formed from materials that looked like they belonged in an art museum rather than a functional living space. "You're nervous," Seraphine observed from across the chamber, where she was reviewing something on a holographic display. Her eyes shifted to that curious amber color again, the one that Marcus was beginning to associate with her amusement at his expense. "I'm not nervous," Marcus lead, adjusting his uniform for approximately the 100th time in the past 5 minutes. "I'm just trying to understand the protocol for this. Whatever this is." Seraphine dismissed the holographic display with a wave of her hand and turned to face him fully. She wore something that wasn't quite clothing and wasn't quite armor, a garment that seemed designed to both protect and reveal, crafted from the same iridescent material as her skin. "The protocol is simple. We spend time together. We talk. We eat. We learn whether we can function as partners in both intimate and governance capacities." "Over 30 days, Marcus added, still struggling to accept that somehow his casual romantic comment had resulted in a month-long engagement trial. Over 30 days, Seraphine confirmed, moving toward him with the fluid grace that seemed to be a characteristic of her species. At the conclusion, we decide whether to formalize the marriage contract or dissolve it with honor. A soft chime echoed through the chamber, and Marcus turned to see a figure entering through what he hadn't even realized was a door. The man was distinctly Calithian, with the same shimmering skin as Seraphine, though his coloration leaned toward deeper blues and greens. His expression was professionally neutral, but his eyes sparkled with something that Marcus suspected might be amusement. "Your Majesty," the newcomer said with a slight bow, "the evening meal is prepared in the formal dining chamber. Ambassador Vale, I am Kale, Seraphine's primary advisor, and, for the duration of your courtship trial, your guide to Calithian customs." Marcus found himself grateful for Kale's appearance. The man's presence seemed to diffuse some of the tension that had been building in the chamber, replacing it with something that almost felt professional. Almost. "How long have you been Seraphine's advisor?" Marcus asked as they walked through corridors that seemed to shift and reorganize themselves as they passed through. 17 years, Kale replied, "which means I have had the distinct privilege of watching her navigate every political crisis, personal challenge, and diplomatic nightmare the galaxy has thrown at the Calithian collective. I have also had the distinct displeasure of watching her date precisely 3 people, each one more unsuitable than the last." Seraphine made a sound that might have been a growl, or might have been laughter. "Kale believes he has the right to commentary on my personal choices." "I have the obligation," Kale corrected, his eyes twinkling with undisguised humor. "As someone who has dedicated his life to your welfare, I feel compelled to point out when you make questionable decisions, such as accepting marriage proposals from humans you've known for less than a week." Marcus couldn't help but laugh at that. "He's very honest." "He's very annoying," Seraphine countered, but her eyes had shifted to a warm purple that suggested affection rather than anger. "But he's rarely wrong, which is why I tolerate him." The dining chamber was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. The room seemed to exist partially outside normal space, with one entire wall opening directly onto the vast expanse of the cosmos. They could see stars swirling in patterns that suggested they were traveling through some kind of hyperspace corridor. The table itself was organic, grown from the same living material as much of the ship, and it seemed to pulse gently with bioluminescence. 2 place settings had been prepared, and Seraphine gestured for Marcus to sit across from her. The meal that appeared was a study in elegant presentation, though Marcus had no idea what most of it actually was. Seraphine noticed his hesitation and smiled. "I've ensured that half of the meal consists of foods that are safe for human consumption," she said, pointing to a section of the spread. "Kale provided your dietary requirements from your personnel file." Marcus felt something warm settle in his chest at that small gesture. It wasn't romantic in any dramatic sense, but it was thoughtful in a way that suggested she actually cared about his comfort. He selected something that looked vaguely like seafood and took a careful bite. It was delicious, with a flavor profile that seemed to shift on his tongue, starting sweet and gradually becoming more complex. "Tell me about your family," Seraphine said as they ate. Her eyes had shifted to a more neutral silver, the color he was beginning to associate with curiosity. "You've had minimal personal information in your diplomatic profile." Marcus was surprised by the question, but found himself answering honestly. "My mother was a cultural anthropologist. My father was a systems engineer. They met on some research colony and decided to have me despite having careers that required constant travel. I spent my childhood on different planets, never really belonging to any of them fully." "Which is why you became a diplomat," Seraphine observed. "A career that offered you the freedom to move between worlds without apology." Marcus set down his fork, genuinely impressed. "That's remarkably insightful for our 6-day acquaintance." "I told you I know you," Seraphine replied. And you're not particularly complicated, Marcus Vale. Beneath all the diplomatic training and careful neutrality, you're someone searching for the place where you belong. Someone who values genuine connection over political advantage. Before Marcus could respond, a second chime echoed through the chamber, and another figure entered. This one was definitively human, with the sort of easy confidence that came from someone comfortable in any environment. He was dressed in civilian clothing rather than a uniform, and he carried himself with the particular swagger of someone who had spent too much time in space stations and not enough time following protocol. "Dante," Marcus said, standing immediately. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same question," Dante replied, grinning as he approached the table. "Though I think the gossip networks have made it pretty clear. You accidentally got engaged to an alien queen. That's going to be the most embarrassing story of your life." Seraphine's eyes shifted to an amused gold. "So this must be the friend you mentioned during one of our conversations. The one who has terrible social skills, but somehow maintains popularity through sheer force of personality." Dante looked genuinely delighted. "You must be Seraphine. Marcus didn't mention that you were absolutely radiant. So just to confirm, he said something unbelievably stupid, and you said yes? That's the most romantic thing I've ever heard." Dante was stationed on Nexus Station, Marcus explained to Seraphine, even as he shot his friend a look that promised retribution. "We met 3 years ago during a diplomatic misunderstanding that somehow resulted in a friendship." Cale gestured for Dante to join them, and another place setting materialized on the table. Over the next several hours, Marcus found himself experiencing something he hadn't expected: genuine enjoyment. Dante and Cale seemed to have an established rapport, suggesting they had met and interacted before this moment. Seraphine laughed more freely in Dante's presence, her initial formality dissolving into something more relaxed and natural as the evening wore on. Dante eventually excused himself, citing some unspecified business that Marcus suspected was entirely fabricated to give them privacy. Cale also departed with a knowing look that suggested he understood exactly what was happening. Alone, again in the vast dining chamber, with only the cosmic expanse as witness, Marcus and Seraphine sat in comfortable silence. "I'm terrified," Marcus said finally. "Not of you. Of this. Of the commitment. Of getting this wrong." Seraphine reached across the table and took his hand. Her skin was warm, with a texture that was smooth, but seemed to shift subtly beneath his touch. "Fear suggests significance," she said quietly. "And significance suggests that this matters. I think that's a good place to begin. What happens if we get 30 days in and realize we're not compatible? Then we dissolve the contract with honor, and we both return to our lives having learned something valuable about ourselves and each other," Seraphine replied. "But Marcus, I don't think that's what's going to happen." "No?" he asked, turning her hand over slowly, marveling at the way the bioluminescence beneath her skin seemed to respond to his touch. "No," she confirmed. "I think in 30 days, you're going to realize that you meant every word you said in that observation lounge. And I think I'm going to make sure you want to say those words again, this time with complete intent." Marcus leaned forward, and Seraphine met him halfway across the table. When their lips met, it was soft and tentative, a first kiss that carried the weight of all the impossible complications that surrounded them. It tasted like promise and risk in equal measure, like the beginning of something that would either transform both their worlds or destroy everything they had built. When they finally pulled apart, Seraphine's eyes had shifted to a color Marcus had never seen before, a blend of pink and gold that seemed to glow from within. "Welcome to your courtship trial," she whispered. "I have a feeling it's going to be considerably more interesting than either of us anticipated." 15 days into the courtship trial, Marcus had begun to understand why the Calithian Collective maintained such meticulous records of every political decision and diplomatic treaty. Seraphine spent her days navigating the incredibly complex governmental structures that held 7 different star systems in a delicate balance of cooperation. What he hadn't expected was the weight that responsibility placed on her shoulders, or the way she compartmentalized her stress until her eyes cycled through colors so rapidly they became almost monochromatic. They had fallen into a routine that felt natural despite its artificial framework. Mornings were spent in governance meetings, where Marcus was gradually being introduced to the political landscape he would theoretically inherit if the courtship trial resulted in marriage. Afternoons belonged to them, stolen moments where they explored the verdant symphony together. Evenings dissolved into conversations that ranged from philosophy to personal history, each exchange building layers of understanding between them. It was during one of these evening conversations, in the ancient library that occupied the lower levels of the ship, that Marcus began to see cracks in the carefully maintained facade Seraphine presented to the galaxy. The library was unlike any repository of knowledge Marcus had encountered. Instead of conventional data storage, information existed in crystalline matrices that seemed to organize themselves according to some logic that transcended human understanding. Seraphine moved through the aisles with obvious comfort, her fingers trailing across the crystals as though reading Braille written in starlight. "This section contains the history of the Calithian people before we unified," she explained, pulling Marcus toward a particularly luminous collection. "Before I became ruler of the collective, we were 7 separate civilizations engaged in what could generously be called Cold War." Marcus studied the crystals, watching as images flickered through them. He could see scenes of conflict, political maneuvering, desperate moments when the 7 civilizations had come terrifyingly close to open warfare. "How long were you fighting?" 300 years, Seraphine said quietly. "Not continuously, of course. There were periods of trade and attempted diplomacy. But fundamentally, we were divided. My predecessor, my mother, attempted to broker peace through a series of arranged marriages between the ruling families of different systems. Did it work?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer based on the somber tone of her voice. "Partially." Seraphine moved to another section of the library where the crystals seemed darker, containing images that made her eyes shift to a pained violet. "My mother's strategy was sound in theory. She married my eldest brother to the daughter of the Northern System's ruler. She married my sister to the leader of the Western Territories. She was planning to arrange my marriage to the Prince of the Southern Collective when everything fell apart." Seraphine paused, and Marcus watched her struggle with something internal, some weight she had been carrying alone for too long. "What happened?" he asked gently, taking her hand. "The prince was assassinated. A political extremist who believed that marriage-based unification was cultural contamination. He killed the prince, and the southern systems blamed my mother's government for inadequate security. It triggered a diplomatic crisis that nearly undid everything she had worked toward." Seraphine's eyes had shifted to a deep, almost black silver. "My mother spent the next 15 years rebuilding those relationships personally. She negotiated not just with political leaders, but with the people themselves. She visited every major settlement, listened to every grievance, and slowly, painstakingly, rebuilt trust. And then?" Marcus prompted, sensing there was more to the story. "And then she died. Exhausted from years of diplomatic intensity, her body simply gave out. I was 23 years old, and suddenly I was responsible for maintaining the fragile peace she had constructed. The governments of the 7 systems were watching to see if I would be capable of the same dedication. The people were waiting to see if their new ruler had any of her wisdom." Marcus pulled Seraphine to one of the comfortable seating areas scattered throughout the library. She settled against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, feeling the tension that lived constantly in her shoulders. You are too young for that burden, he said quietly. Perhaps, but the burden existed regardless of my readiness. So I became what my people needed: a leader, a strategist, someone who could hold 7 civilizations together while maintaining the individual identity of each. She turned to look at him, and her eyes had softened to a melancholy blue. I became so focused on governance that I forgot to be a person, Marcus. I forgot what it meant to want something simply because it brought joy rather than strategic advantage. Before Marcus could respond, a sound echoed through the library. Footsteps, coming rapidly closer. Seraphine tensed immediately, her eyes cycling through colors and patterns that suggested alarm. The figure that emerged from between the crystal matrices was unmistakably human. He was tall, with dark hair and the kind of handsome features that seemed designed by evolution to be charming. His eyes registered shock when he saw Marcus sitting so intimately with Seraphine, and his expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something that looked like betrayal. "Marcus?" a man said, moving closer. "What are you doing here?" Marcus felt his stomach drop as recognition hit him. "Vexel?" "The name is Velder now," the man corrected coldly. "I've gone by my mother's family name for the past 8 years, since leaving the diplomatic service." "Wait," Marcus stood up, his mind racing. "You're the cultural expert that Seraphine brought aboard 2 weeks ago, the one working on the integration protocols for the treaty." Seraphine also stood, and Marcus could see her reasserting her royal composure, her eyes shifting back to that careful silver that suggested political calculation. Yes, Velder was highly recommended for the position. His expertise in cross-cultural dynamics is exceptional. "Velder and I were colleagues," Marcus explained, though something in Velder's expression suggested that Velder was not going to take this news well. "We worked together on the Centauri diplomatic mission 7 years ago. We were close friends." Velder's eyes flashed with something that might have been pain, or might have been anger, or being the operative word. "You abandoned the friendship when your career path diverged from mine. You climbed the diplomatic ladder while I stayed in the field work, and eventually you stopped returning my messages." Marcus felt the weight of that accusation settle on him, and he couldn't deny its truth. In the pursuit of advancement, he had let relationships fall away. "Velder, congratulations on your engagement." "By the way," Velder interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I heard the gossip. Accidental proposal to an alien queen. Very you, Marcus. Very spontaneous and completely uncalculated. Except I know you well enough to know that nothing you do is truly spontaneous." "So what was it? Did she seem powerful enough to help your career? Did marrying her offer some strategic advantage?" "That's enough," Seraphine said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. It was the first time Marcus had heard her use the full force of her royal bearing, and it was terrifying in its completeness. "Velder, you are an employee of the Colethian Collective. You do not speak to me or my betrothed with that tone." Velder bowed stiffly, but his eyes remained fixed on Marcus. "Of course, Your Majesty. My apologies. I was simply surprised by developments." "You may return to your quarters," Seraphine continued coolly. "Your services on the integration protocol are no longer required. You'll be compensated according to your contract, and transport will be arranged to return you to Nexus Station." After Velder left, Marcus turned to Seraphine. "You didn't have to do that. He was right about some things. I was a terrible friend to him." Seraphine moved back to the crystals, her shoulders tense. "He was disrespectful and emotionally manipulative. Regardless of his legitimate grievances, his behavior was inappropriate. But I hurt him," Marcus said, "and I was so focused on my career that I didn't even realize it was happening until it was too late." Seraphine turned back to face him, and he saw vulnerability flicker across her features before she carefully controlled her expression. Is that what you think this is? Another step on your career ladder? No, Marcus said immediately. Seraphine, no. This is the first thing I've done in years that wasn't calculated for advantage. This is the first time I've wanted something simply because I wanted it. Simply because you matter to me. Then why do you look guilty? She asked quietly. Marcus moved toward her, and when she didn't pull away, he cupped her face gently in his hands. Because I'm terrified that I'm going to hurt you the way I hurt Nelder. Because I'm afraid that somewhere deep down, there's still the ambitious diplomat who's willing to sacrifice relationships for advancement. And because I can't promise that the person you're falling in love with is better. And the person I used to be, Seraphine's eyes shifted to that vulnerable pink-gold color he had come to recognize as her most honest emotional state. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Marcus. I'm asking you to try, to be present in this relationship, to value what we're building more than any advancement. Can you do that? Yes, Marcus said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. Seraphine, I love you. I know it's fast, and it's probably insane given the circumstances, but it's true. I love you. Seraphine pulled him closer, and their kiss was different from the first one in the dining chamber. This kiss carried the weight of vulnerability, of shared secrets, of genuine intimacy that transcended species and politics and all the complicated logistics that surrounded them. When they finally pulled apart, Seraphine rested her forehead against his. I love you too, Marcus Vale, which is why I need to tell you something else. Something that I've been carrying alone for far too long. What? Marcus asked, holding her close. When my mother died, there were rumors that her death was not natural, that someone in the government had arranged for her to be slowly poisoned, administered in small doses that would appear to be the result of exhaustion and age. Seraphine's voice had dropped to barely a whisper. I've spent the past 8 years investigating, trying to determine if there was truth to those rumors. And Marcus, I found evidence that suggests one of the 7 system governors was involved in her death. Marcus felt his blood run cold. Seraphine, if that's true, if it's true that I'm living with a murderer in my government every day, and if I make a move against them without absolute proof, it could shatter the fragile peace my mother built and the unity I've worked so hard to maintain. Seraphine looked at him with desperation in her eyes. I don't know how to carry this alone anymore, and I don't know if I can bring someone into my life without burdening them with this truth. Marcus took her hands and squeezed gently. You're not carrying it alone anymore. Whatever this is, whatever comes next, we face it together. That's what partnership means. That's what love means. Seraphine nodded, and in the embrace of the ancient library, surrounded by the crystalline records of her people's history, they held each other. Marcus understood now why Seraphine had been so careful, so controlled, so focused on governance. She had been surviving, not living. And somehow, in the space of 15 days and one accidental proposal, Marcus had become the person she was willing to let in. The courtship trial had 15 days remaining, but Marcus already knew how his answer would be. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever secrets needed to be uncovered, whatever threats existed to the peace they were trying to build together, he would face them with Seraphine at his side, and she would face them with him.